day or so. And so it's just projectwildfire.org, and you can find it right there on our website. So with that, Boone, I'll turn it over to you for a quick update. And you're on mute still.
Yep, definitely Monday on Tuesday. So I'm going to keep this pretty quick for updates and just kind of run through these fairly quickly. Thinking about our big rocks, the things that we're working on. Firewise communities continue to move forward. We're scheduling, I think I got 3 in the hopper as far as assessments that are being done. So those are added to the list of others that are somewhere in the process. So we have somewhere probably just shy of 10 neighborhoods or sites, if you will, that are working through that process that hopefully we'll be able to get the majority of those, or at least a good portion of them, done over this year. We're going to talk about a story map related to Firewise communities later in the meeting, so I'm not going to dive into that right now. The CWPPs, as I've been stating in the past, we're planning to do the Bend one this year. I haven't sent out the invites or begun the planning process. Just had a conversation last week about that, so that'll be coming out soon. Along with the CWPPs, we're planning to put together a CWPP story map similar to the one you're going to see today, just that we're going to focus on story maps and then, on the CWPPs, show the differences and the similarities between those, and hopefully consolidate them to one place where it's a little bit more consumable for the average person as they look at the CWPPs and want to learn more. Probably the big news that we've got right now is the Fire Free. We've got our dates, and actually I'll put those into the chat. We've got our dates solidified, or tentatively solidified, if you will. But we have our dates right now, and there they are in the chat. So we have the not landfill May 1st through the May 16th. The transfer stations will be happening afterwards, and that's kind of to mitigate some of the workload as far as actually scheduling people and getting volunteers out there. So I'll be soliciting for volunteers here in the next couple of weeks as we're heading down that direction. The West Side location, a lot of folks have been asking about that as far as whether we're going to have it or not. And we just got the agreement signed to use the tree farm, same site as last year. We'll be going out and talking over the flow for traffic here shortly. We should be looking at the same flow for traffic and then coordinating with those guys out there to make sure that they're not going to have equipment in the site during that time. And then one other project that we've begun to work on, and we're in the planning phases of things, but we're beginning to go down that road, is, as you guys are all aware, we have several handouts and brochures that are kind of out of date. The Project Wildfire one and Fire Free, among a couple others, but we've been in talks about this for a while as far as updating those, getting them to a point where we can we'll have something that can last a little bit longer, and then also we can easily adapt it and change it over time. So we're in the process of combining some of those handouts and updating them. We've just, for the most part, laid them out and talked about how we want to do it, but hopefully in the next couple of months we'll have something that we can bring back to the group to take a look at and see what everybody thinks. And with that, I think that's everything, unless I'm missing something, Ed, that is standing out there.
I think that's the highlights, Boone. Thank you. All right, with that. Oh,
I got one more because it popped up in the chat. Yeah, Bob added this into the chat, but we also updated our contractors list. So we've had that contractors list that we put on the Project Wildfire webpage, and I believe it may actually be on the Fire Free webpage, and links between the two. But either way, we did update that recently. Bob Poley, thank you very much, Bob, for all the work, but called through all those contractors and updated it and made sure that those people were still in business. And I believe we added a couple folks to it. And if you have people that need to be added, send them to me and I'll get them added in as well. All right, and that's it.
Great, thanks, Boone. All right, with that, Kyle, if you're ready, we'll maybe I'm assuming you're gonna wanna share your screen, so Boone will maybe end his sharing and I'll just briefly introduce Kyle Collins. Kyle is an associate planner with the Community Development Department. And he is going to be giving us a overview of some of the public outreach surveys. We had a presentation on the story map that CDD put together and the questions that were out there with the community. And so we have those results now, and Kyle's going to give us an overview of that. So with that, Kyle, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. Good morning, everyone. As Ed said, my name's Kyle. I'm an associate planner with the Deschutes County Community Development Department. This will be I think the third time I've gone through this presentation, but basically we as community development staff have gone through a number of public outreach efforts over the last, really beginning in October of last year, to gauge public support or lack thereof for some possible code amendments to deal with wildfire impacts specifically. So this entire presentation, some of it's going to be a little bit basic for the members of this committee, I know, because a lot of it is background on our wildfire history in the region here. But the kind of meat of it is towards the end, and really is what the public feels about moving forward in a more regulatory role in terms of dealing with wildfire impacts. So to move into the actual outreach, so to get some background in the project that we've been working on, that this public outreach report is dealing with. So as I'm sure everyone here is aware, wildfire is a major threat to our communities, Central Oregon, Deschutes County in particular, and we've been grappling with how to deal with some of that underlying risk for quite a while now. And to put that in context, Central Oregon has had high intensity wildland fires on 37% more acreage in the last 15 years versus the previous 100 years combined. And that works out to roughly 105,000 acres burned just since 2005. In addition, our population is increasing, as I'm sure everyone here is aware as well. Approximately 114,000 additional people are expected to move here over the next 25 years, and 245,000 people over the next 50 years. And that includes an additional 20,000 people within our unincorporated areas over the next 50 years. So a lion's share of our population growth is happening in our incorporated cities, places like Bend and the city of Redmond. But there are a pretty significant number of people moving to our unincorporated and rural areas of the county, and they're predominantly the ones that are affected by these wildland fire events. In order to deal with that, the Deschutes County Planning Division has been evaluating a number of possible code changes that might explicitly deal with some of these properties located in high wildland fire areas. And specifically, in the fall of 2018, CDD staff and the Board of County Commissioners began discussing a previous audit of our code that was done by the University of Oregon's Community Service Center. And this happened to overlap with the State Building Codes Division consideration of an amendment, excuse me, to the Oregon Residential Specialty Code, which would have prescribed fire hardening standards for any new development in those areas. And that state level code amendment was ultimately adopted by the state of Oregon and then made available for local adoption. So in September of 2019, after this code audit evaluation, the Board of County Commissioners appointed the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee. I think some people here were a part of that committee to investigate several of the objectives that might be related to wildfire mitigation. And ultimately that committee, which consisted of 12 voting members, held meetings throughout the end of 2019 and into the early portion of 2020.
Hey, Kyle?
Of course.
You're still on your front slide. I'm not sure if.
Oh, is it not advancing?
No.
That's strange. Okay, let's see if I do this, if this will work.
There it goes.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Now we can see it.
Presenter view, but yeah, it's at least moved. Yep.
That's strange. It's never done that before. Let's see. Let me back up a little bit here. There we go. So throughout that process, the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee was convened to undertake the following objectives. One was to review that code amendment at the state level, the building code amendment, to review whether or not wildfire mitigation standards as described in R327, that's the state building code amendment that was ultimately adopted, should be brought into Deschutes County's building jurisdiction, and to review and recommend whether or not any land use regulations that were advised by the Community Service Center from the University of Oregon should be brought in to our local development code. A final report from the Mitigation Advisory Committee was presented to the Board of County Commissioners and our Planning Commission in April of 2020. And ultimately, they made some recommendations regarding our wildfire hazard zone and in determining where the standards of R327 should apply. So a portion of the Mitigation Advisory Committee members advised that the new building code standard should apply to at least some areas of Deschutes County, but they were split on which areas they should actually be applied. And I'll go into that in a little more detail in a second. But a majority of Mitigation Advisory Committee members advised that defensible space standards should be put in place for all properties, both vacant and developed within the rural portions of the county. In determining where the standards of R327 should apply, the reason the WMAC members were split has to do with our wildfire hazard zone. So the way that the state building codes are written only allows R327 to apply in designated wildfire hazard zones. In Deschutes County, we've had a hazard zone for wildfire adopted since 2001. And in this case, it actually applies to every portion of our rural county. So excluding the incorporated cities of Bend, Redmond, Sisters, and Lapine, as you can see on this map here, every other portion of rural Deschutes County is actually currently designated as a wildfire hazard zone. And thus, if R327 were adopted at a local level, it would actually apply broadly to the entirety of Deschutes County, in this case, rural Deschutes County. After the WMAC committee convened their final session, Deschutes County received a technical assistance grant from the Department of Land Conservation and Development at a state level, and specifically to incorporate the findings from the WMAC committee into our comprehensive plan and development code. And as I said earlier, throughout the fall and winter of 2020, CDD staff undertook a series of public outreach initiatives to gauge the community interest in either of these two proposals, the adoption of R327 or the adoption of defensible space standards. So to move forward into the specific proposed amendments. So again, based on those WMAC recommendation, the two possible code amendments that we put towards the public to see their interest, or again, lack thereof, was an update to our local building code, which would require any new residential construction in wildfire hazard zones to incorporate certain fire hardening standards. So things related to roofing, ventilation, exterior walls, overhang projections, decking surfaces, etc. And the second proposed amendment would be an update to our Deschutes County Code, which would require defensible space for all rural residential properties. And to move into our public outreach section, as I'm sure everyone's aware, the pandemic that we're still a part of made public outreach fairly challenging. And so we were limited in the ability to actually get out to community members, particularly in regards to in-person meetings. We couldn't have in-person meetings, and so we had to find a workaround. But we ultimately did conclude that kind of a multi-pronged approach was going to be the best way to actually get these possible code amendments out and hear what the community felt. And we came up with a strategy that we think was fairly successful. The first part of it was a communications plan that was predominantly done online. This was through a series of press releases, social media blasts, the Community Development Department's electronic newsletter, an ArcGIS story map, and an online survey that was attached to an ArcGIS story map. The second part was a series of virtual open houses that were held in conjunction with the Deschutes County Planning Commission. Those were done on November 19th and December 3rd. And specifically, it was to discuss the story map feature itself and the project specifics beyond the information that was included in those online materials. And then the last piece was a statistically valid phone survey that was conducted by a consultant, Nelson Research Incorporated, of residents, predominantly rural residents, but kind of a split between rural and urban residents in Deschutes County to understand their support for adoption of these two possible amendments. So the survey questions in both the online survey as well as the phone survey conducted by Nelson Research asked the following suite of questions. So 1, are you a resident that's living within Deschutes County? 2, how vulnerable is your home to wildfire? And that's a self-perceived risk there. 3, do you support additional building codes which would require fire-resistant building materials when constructing a new home in rural Deschutes County? 4, if Deschutes County required additional fire-resistant materials for new homes, where should they apply? Again, going back to that wildfire hazard zone, which is the only place that R327 standards could apply. And then 5, if building a new home of approximately 2,400 square feet, how much would you be willing to add to the construction costs to incorporate those R327 measures into that new home construction? And this question was added in really to try to give community members the best cost estimates we had at this time for what it might mean to incorporate some of these fire hardening standards if they were going to build a house. And then finally, defensible space is required currently in all of our forest use zones. And would you consider expanding those requirements to all existing and new development within rural portions of the county? So in total, we received approximately 801 responses to the online survey, with just shy of 500 of those responses coming from people living directly in rural Deschutes County, which is again the residents that would be affected ultimately by adoption of these amendments. And the phone survey itself had approximately 383 respondents, and that was weighted even more heavily based on recommendations from county staff towards rural residents. So in that case, we had approximately 75% rural residents responding to the phone survey and 25% coming from the incorporated cities. The 2 open houses, the virtual open houses, were conducted via Zoom, as we're doing here today, and each was simultaneously streamed and recorded via Facebook Live and posted to the county's social media profile. And as of January, mid-January of this year, those 2 recorded events, the first has been viewed a total of 620 approximately individual times. And the second event has been viewed approximately 450 times. I think those numbers have likely changed in the interim. So it's probably gone up since that January 12th date. But on to the results of those outreach initiatives. So of the total respondents to our online survey, about 86% of community members feel that their homes are at least somewhat vulnerable or extremely vulnerable to wildfire damage. And when directing the question specifically to rural residents in the county, that number actually goes up to nearly 90%. Just shy of 89% of respondents feel that their homes are somewhat vulnerable or extremely vulnerable to wildfire damage. Here's a breakdown of showing those numbers of vulnerability. And then this is just for the rural residents in the county. When asked about additional requirements for fire-resistant building materials, about 67% were supportive of including those new standards. About 22% were not supportive, and the remaining 10% were undecided one way or the other. Generally, they wish to provide more contextual answers or see what the implementation would actually wind up being in on the ground conditions before either submitting their support or removing their support. When directing that same question to just residents in the rural county, the numbers do change a little bit, but not significantly. About 61% were supportive within the rural portions of the county for including these new standards. About 28% were not supportive. And again, the remaining roughly 10% were undecided one way or the other. Here's a breakdown of all residents in the county regarding new building standards, and then a breakdown for just those rural residents. Regarding new defensible space requirements for, again, all existing or new development in the county, about 60% of respondents were supportive of those possible new standards. About 24% were not supportive. 10% were undecided one way or the other, and the remaining approximately 4.5% of respondents wanted to provide a more detailed or contextual answer. So in some cases, these were respondents that were supportive but wanted to add more direction in terms of how they believed it should be implemented. Some were not supportive and wanted to provide additional context for why they believed it shouldn't be included. When directing that same question towards just rural residents, about 55% were supportive. Just under 30% were not supportive of new defensible space requirements. About 10% again were undecided one way or the other. And again, the remaining 4.5% of respondents wanted to provide that more detailed or contextual answer. This is a breakdown of all county residents regarding defensible space standards, and then just the rural residents. So as I described earlier, as presently written in the state building code, fire-resistant building materials as described in that R327 new code amendment can only be required in those designated wildfire hazard zones. And as I stated, the entirety of rural Deschutes County is currently designated as our adopted wildfire hazard zone. And so if we wanted to reduce the area that these new building materials would be required if R327 were adopted, we'd also need to change the adopted wildfire hazard zone itself. So we directed that question ultimately to residents. If you wanted to adopt R327, where would you want them to apply? About 57% of residents believe that the existing wildfire hazard zones should remain as it currently stands. About 17% wanted to reduce the wildfire hazard zone to only include forest and rural residential zone properties. About 21% believed that no additional fire-resistant building materials should be required at all. So again, those are unsupportive residents. And the remaining just shy of 4% of respondents wanted to provide a more detailed or contextual answer. When directing that same question to just our rural community members, the numbers change a bit to approximately 53% believe that the existing wildfire hazard zone should be unchanged. About 17% wanted to reduce it down to just the forest and rural residential zone properties. 25% were unsupportive for any new fire resistant building materials, and the remaining 3.5% wanted to provide a more detailed answer. Here's a breakdown of all of our county residents regarding the wildfire hazard zone and just the rural residents. So as I stated earlier, we wanted to provide a relative cost context so people knew approximately how much incorporated fire hardening standards into new development might cost. And in order to do so, we referenced a 2,400 square foot home, a new home that was being built. And residents were given a range of either an increase of $0 above what a normal 2,400 square foot home might cost to build, and upwards of $6,000 to incorporate the standards of R327. And that range of estimates was kind of a middle ground given between figures given by the Central Oregon Builders Association, our local building official vetting some of those estimates from COBA, and then various real estate agencies that were also working in the region. So while this is not a perfect example, obviously some houses might incur significantly more cost to incorporate these standards. Others might incorporate effectively no additional cost to incorporate the standards, as some builders are actually putting in these elements as it stands already. But regarding how much additional money residents would be willing to invest to incorporate fire hardening standards, about 22% stated that they would not expend any additional money. About 46% stated that they would expend up to $6,000, so somewhere between $1,000 and $6,000. And the remaining 30% of respondents stated that they would expend over $6,000 to incorporate those standards. When directing that same question to members in the rural county, the numbers do change, with about 27% stating they wouldn't want to expend any additional money. About 45% stated they would expend some up to $6,000 to incorporate those fire hardening standards. And the remaining 27% stated they would expend more than $6,000 to incorporate R327. Here's a breakdown of all of our county residents regarding costs, and just our rural residents regarding costs. The statistically valid phone survey, as I stated earlier, was run in tandem with our online survey, and ultimately it provided very similar results as our staff prepared survey. When describing vulnerability, this is actually the one portion of the phone survey that differed dramatically from the online survey results. And when responding to the phone survey, about half of the respondents did not believe that their home was vulnerable to wildfire. However, nearly half of rural residents believes that their homes were vulnerable. So we're talking about a roughly 50-50 split between people believing that their homes are vulnerable versus not vulnerable in this phone survey. Which is interesting given that the online survey itself showed an overwhelming majority of residents, both in the rural county and in incorporated areas, believe that their homes were vulnerable. So it's not clear what accounts for that discrepancy. A portion may be affected by the fact that a large majority of older residents in the range of 45 to just shy of 60 years old accounted for 61% of the respondents to the phone survey, and members 60 and older accounted for 57% of the phone survey respondents, and they specifically did not believe that their homes were vulnerable to wildfire. Regarding whether or not they believe fire-resistant building materials should be adopted at a local level, about half of the respondents favored a proposal that would require those new fire-resistant standards. And a majority of respondents in nearly every demographic group, including the rural areas, favored that proposal. Regarding the wildfire hazard zone, again, where R327 would ultimately be applicable, just less than a third preferred that the fire-resistant building material standards should only be required, or should be required, in the existing wildfire hazard zone with no changes made. Just under a third preferred reducing the wildfire hazard zone to include just our forest and rural residential zone properties. And slightly more rural residents preferred enacting those requirements on all of rural Deschutes County over reducing the wildfire hazard zone. So again, about just under a third want to maintain the wildfire hazard zone. Slightly less than that amount, about 30% want to reduce the wildfire hazard zone, and the remaining respondents in this question did not want to implement the standards one way or the other. Regarding cost, about a third of respondents, just under a third of respondents, would be willing to pay up to $6,000 to build a new home, incorporating the standards of R327. However, when accounting for those who would be willing to spend more than $6,000, a majority of respondents say they would be willing to pay for those materials. So when accounting for those willing to spend up to $6,000 and over $6,000, greater than half of the respondents would be willing to incorporate some additional costs. And that includes residents living in the rural areas of the county. Regarding defensible space requirements, a very large number of respondents favored expanding defensible space requirements for any new and existing residents living in rural areas of the county. And that includes a majority of respondents from every demographic group supporting that particular proposal. So as I stated earlier, we were unable to have our any in-person meetings due to the pandemic. But we did facilitate a series of virtual open houses in conjunction with our planning commission, staff members from our building safety division. Both Boone and Ed attended each of these community open houses. And again, they were held in November and December of this past year. They really were intended as an in-person way, a quote in-person way, to introduce community members to our story map feature and the associated online survey from staff, and to give the public an opportunity to ask us more specific questions that might have not been covered in any of our online materials. Again, they were conducted via Zoom platform and shared via Facebook Live on the county's social media page. And participants at both of the open houses were encouraged to submit questions through either of those channels. And we, as staff or Ed and Boone, provided corresponding answers in real time as facilitators. Both open houses covered a fairly wide range of topics, but there were some major themes that popped out, which I'll go over. Some of the big ones were how defensible space standards would be monitored and enforced if they were put in place. That was a big one that came up across both events. How the new building code requirements of R327 would apply to things like additions to existing development or replacements of existing development. How defensible space standards would be balanced against other land use goals and planning goals, things like wildlife habitat preservation, wetland areas, riparian areas. How the new building code requirements of R327 would actually differ from the standards that we currently have in place. Whether any similar provisions had been adopted by other Oregon jurisdictions, and whether those requirements of R327 can be modified beyond what was adopted by the State Building Codes Division. Whether the county could provide any additional resources for property owners to establish defensible space. How the county would navigate challenges like absentee landlords or second homeowners when implementing the proposed code changes. Obviously, this goes more towards defensible space standards. How the defensible space standards would be implemented on properties that have limited space or development area, so substandard properties or subsized properties. And in addition to our 2 open house events, we received over 30 public comments from private citizens and professional organizations and general advocacy groups. And the primary one that I wanted to point out here is we received comments from nearly every fire protection district within a region, and they were unanimous in support for both proposals. So both the adoption of R327 and additional defensible space requirements. So to come into our conclusion here, based on both the virtual open house events, as well as our online survey and the phone survey, across all of our outreach channels, the majority of residents were generally supportive of greater building code and defensible space requirements, which might help to mitigate some of our wildfire impacts. There was some discrepancy between rural residents versus urban residents. Again, I think that's likely comes down to the fact that rural residents are the ones to be the primary persons and parties affected by any of these code adoptions. But even when accounting for that particular discrepancy, a majority of residents within the rural county were broadly supportive of both defensible space requirements as well as new building code requirements. Numerous questions, like I said, were raised, even though there was support about how those standards would be implemented in practice. That's kind of where the rubber meets the road on these, which is going to have some significant influence on whether or not these actually come into play. And numerous challenges ultimately remain, things like administrative responsibility, who takes charge of these amendments. Obviously, our building safety division would be in charge of the adoption of any R327 standards, but defensible space is a much more open question. Things like dealing with non-compliance and code enforcement issues, if any of these are adopted, and possible exemptions to the standards themselves for certain property owners. So moving forward with these results, CDD staff is going to convene another meeting with our Board of Commissioners on February 24th to address the public outreach report in more detail, a more refined discussion of the proposed amendments, so some of the more detailed questions that weren't captured via this outreach, and then a discussion of next steps and what ultimately might occur. And with that, I will open it up to any questions that committee members might have. I know that's a lot of information to take in, so.
Yeah, folks, we have a bit of time built in. So if you have questions, either just come off mute, or if you want to use the raise hand function, or we can use the chat. So whichever works for you, but we do have some time for discussion.
I've got a question.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, as the defensible space, would that, see how that would possibly affect all properties, current and new construction, correct?
So it's not entirely clear how that would be implemented. It could occur in a variety of ways. I think that's one of the implementation questions. We haven't made decisions one way or the other. It could apply, for example, to just new proposed development, in much the same way as our forest use zones currently apply them. So when you come in to construct, let's say, a new house in the forest use zone, one of the requirements that we apply at a planning level is you have to implement defensible space around that new structure, and it's checked prior to the issuance of building permits, et cetera. So it's possible that it would be implemented in the same way countywide, for example, if these are put in place, or it may be more broad reaching and actually apply to existing development as well, which, as you can imagine, hosts its own challenges with how that would be put in place. But ultimately, I don't think decisions have been made one way or the other.
Okay.
Oliver.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. I was struck, and I want to make sure that I understand what you said, that the discrepancy in surveys between the phone and the online survey, and that there was more support in the online survey than in the phone survey, but the phone survey tended to skew older.
Correct.
Okay. And I was really struck by the number of respondents who felt that their home was not vulnerable to wildfire.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we have any sense of, does that reflect because people have already been doing this work using fire-resistant building materials and clearing defensible space, or is it just a lack of awareness of their own vulnerability? Do we have a sense of how many people have already done this?
That I don't think we have clear answers on. So I think there's, just thinking about this data and kind of digesting over the last few weeks, I think there are two possible answers that do likely capture a lot of this. But again, some of this is just conjecture on my part, so take it with a grain of salt.
Sure.
One is the outcome you identified just now, which is some of our rural residents are likely already incorporating some of these standards on their own properties and may feel that those efforts have paid off and reduced their vulnerability. So that's one possible answer. And the second one, which is a little harder to dial in, which is our online survey, because it was attached to our story map feature, which actually broke down a very database history of wildfire impacts to our region and ongoing programs that the county's already undertaken. It may have primed residents to understand what was actually occurring in their communities that wasn't based on things like personal anecdotes or their own personal history with wildfire. And so it may have effectively just educated community members much greater than the phone survey, which didn't have that leading in approach description of historical examples. So I think probably some combination of those two things is what led to such a reduced sense of vulnerability in the phone survey.
Kyle, thanks for your presentation. I still think that that's an interesting theory, because then that would be, folks potentially being influenced by that story map and learning about that for the first time. So that, that would still mean that a lot of folks before viewing that material are potentially unaware of their vulnerability to fire. So I don't know, I still found that to be interesting to me, but I'm curious then, maybe I missed this, but did you say how you selected where the phone calls were focused?
So county staff, when we did our phone survey through a consultant that's handled these types of statistically valid surveys in the past, and ultimately, the only influence that we provided was we wanted it to be more heavily weighted towards rural residents, because again, they're the ones primarily affected by any of these code adoptions. And so we gave a breakdown of percentage we wanted from the rural county versus the urban county, that 75-25 split. So 75% rural residents, 25% urban. And then the actual selection of the sample size itself was undertaken by Nelson Research based on voting precinct data. And so our county clerk provided voting precinct data to Nelson Research. And ultimately they had a much larger sample of, I want to say 20,000 that they could have selected from. And then based on those percentages, to get a valid sample size, they wintered it down to that roughly 383 respondents. So it's split broadly across the county. It could have been areas of South County, areas of around Sisters, west of Bend, east of Bend, et cetera.
Okay.
So
So
it's
distributed
kind of
in some way, but still randomly.
It's intended to be representative of the county as a whole, but there's more confidence in the rural resident respondents versus the urban residents respondents, again, because of the initial weighting that was placed in there.
Copy. Okay. And so a follow-up question is, I'm wondering if there's any discussion on, in addition to creating these codes, also creating some form of incentive programs or assistance programs for individuals that would go along with it. I mean, my fear would be for any of the low-income rural communities being somewhat forced then to stay within the existing homes that they're in, which then are not up to this code, and then not them being able to afford if they were to build anywhere else.
No, that's a great point. Ultimately, I think those are questions that, again, break into this where the rubber meets the road implementation challenges. So no major discussions, at least at this point, regarding how these might be put in place. Is it truly regulatory? Is it more of an incentive-based program? And that exact same concern that you brought up, the how does this affect maybe more cost burden residents in the county? How do they factor into this? And that's actually one of the primary things that came up in both open house events is how do you implement these, given that there is going to be some incurred cost for both sets of standards one way or the other. And so no major direction one way or the other. I think those are the things to figure out in the future at additional public meetings as we decide whether or not these are going to be adopted.
Thanks.
Ray, it looks like you have your hand up. You have a question?
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the story map that you did. Very, very educational, very informative, brings people up to speed. Two questions. One is, I don't know if you can answer or not. Are there any plans to either share this or coordinate with this, the results and the proposals with the urban areas? I understand the city of Bend is looking at some code changes, maybe ordinance changes right now, but are you going to be working with them?
I don't believe that we are going to be working directly with them. So obviously the city has its own legislative process to adopt very similar codes if they chose to undertake this. And you're correct. And I understand that the city of Bend in particular is looking at possibly adopting some very similar sets of standards. And ultimately, we could certainly provide them with what our outreach results were, given that there's probably some overlap with residents in those areas. But as of this point, I don't believe we've heard any communication from any parties in any of the incorporated cities, other than the city of Sisters. Actually, they have reached out to us directly to get some of these results and what our steps are moving forward. But outside of them, it's really just been Deschutes County.
I would add, and Boone will probably jump in here too, that there's a couple city staff that are in the meeting today, so they're hearing it firsthand. But Boone has been asked to sit on the committee, so I don't know, Boone, if you want to mention that briefly, just so that there is communication going on between the city and the county.
Yeah, I think just to add, right, I don't know about the direct communication between the two groups, but I'm sitting on the committee. It's the Bend Wildfire Resiliency Steering Committee. And so as this meeting was coming up, this Project Wildfire meeting today is happening, I extended the invitation out to everybody on that steering committee, and there's several folks from that steering committee on here today, not just the city, but several other people here.
Gotcha. Yeah, and we would certainly be willing to share any of this information with any of the cities if they wanted it.
Yeah, I would think, if we're going to implement some of these construction changes, it might be less confusing if it was uniform throughout the entire county, including urban areas. And it might somehow affect or decrease the cost differences, perceived cost differences for construction from urban to rural. The other question I had is, I was told by a local contractor who's rebuilding a house up here that burned in Woodside, that he and everybody who are building new homes now are using composition siding, not wood siding anymore. And he said there's practically no difference in costs in terms of building the homes this way and building it to the fire resistant standards. Is that true, or is that not? Does anybody know?
I can point out, at least when we were reaching out to find our cost estimates that were included in our survey questions, there was a broad range of responses from contractors and local building officials. So you went everything from exactly what you're describing, where certain contractors were saying, hey, we're already incorporating either all or a majority of these standards into some of our construction practices. And that's ultimately where you get the $0 amount, where we're already going to put these in, and so it's not going to increase costs at all. Other contractors had significantly, and real estate agents had significantly different concerns. Some of the estimates were upwards of $15,000 to incorporate the full suite of these standards across new development. And so without having a true reliable estimate of exactly what this would cost on a case-by-case basis, which may ultimately be impossible. I mean, homes differ in terms of size, in terms of location value. There's all sorts of variables to put in place. And so we really intended to give a whole suite of what this might incur if you were building something like a 2,400 square foot home as just It was more or less just an arbitrary size based on our average house size across the county.
Yeah, because I would think one of our major concerns, if this goes out to the public, is affordable housing. What constitutes affordable housing, and will this somehow affect it, or do we take into consideration the overall cost, including the cost of rebuilding, and put that into say this also costs is affordable housing costs? So just concerned about that because I know that's the #1 concern in city council races in Bend, at least this year, and probably extends into Redmond too.
No, absolutely. Yeah, there are certainly trade-offs and lots of interrelating factors to weigh when thinking about all this.
All right, I don't see anybody else with a hand up. Last call for any questions for Kyle before we move on in our agenda. Okay, Kyle, it looks like you're off the hook.
Awesome.
Thank you very much for joining us today and for the presentation. I know it had to do with quite a few folks attending today, over 40 folks tuning in to the meeting today. I know there's a lot of interest around this issue, so appreciate you spending some time with us.
And I will, I'll plug my email address into the chat box if people have additional questions that they want to send my way offline.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. All right, I think we'll turn it over to Boone then. And we're going to, I don't know if folks had a chance, but we did send out the link to this story map in advance of the meeting. This is very much a draft story map that we're looking for your input on. So Boone's going to run us through there, and then we'll have a little bit of time for a discussion on this as well.
Okay. So yeah, like Ed said, this was sent out ahead of time. So I do hope that if you've seen it and you have comments, you can email those over to me and we can discuss some of them today too, time willing. So we put this together. So this is the Firewise story map. We put it together kind of focusing two groups, two audiences. One would be existing Firewise communities. And that was to kind of share some of the ways that they've been working as being Firewise projects they've done, and help to kind of profile and highlight some of the good work that's happening out there, right? There's a lot that happens every year that I think definitely goes noticed in the communities, but between one another, you may not know that it's happening. And then the other side of it was communities that are interested in becoming Firewise. So what it means, what are the things that are going on, who all is already Firewise, and we're trying to help not just educate those folks, as we know, right? Social sciences tell us that we can educate people as much as we want. We may not persuade them. A bigger persuader is just seeing that others are doing it, and that tends to get more done, right? In Firewise, we want all that stuff to get done because the aggregate effect of everyone doing their part really builds up. So new sites, people that actually want, or communities or places that want to become Firewise. And the other side of this to keep in mind, is I had to keep this in mind myself, was we're not creating this for the average person that just stumbles across it on the internet, right? So this gets very specific to Firewise, and I was just picturing like the average person looking at it, they would get bored with what we put together, I think, if they weren't heavily involved with Firewise. Okay. So let me see, how do I want to go through this? So I think we started off just kind of talking about Firewise on so I want to cover the flow of this thing, kind of frame up how we put it together, and then we can come back around to comments at the end here. So we went through this talking about fire in Central Oregon, and then we kind of talked about that, communities, the role that we begin to play in this. And then also we frame it up right from the start that, right, fire is part of our environment. We're going to see it on the landscape. It's not a question of if, but when fire occurs next to us or when it impacts us. So we dive into some of the fire history to kind of frame up where we're at. So we used very similar stuff on that other story map that Kyle was referring to. And I'm not going to read through all of this for you guys, and I apologize for scrolling through it quickly. Right, the high points that we're trying to pull out from this is that we've suppressed fires from the turn of the century up to now. We have a continued fuel increase in loading out there. And this is, you know, we can talk about this in other landscapes, but for our landscape, that is one of our largest drivers of our large fires out there. There's some other management decisions happening and things happening that drive our increased acreage up every year. But a large part of that is due to the fuel buildup that's out there. And we can see that through this photo series on the left. That's all from one photo point, pretty amazing. This one large tree going from open stands to filling in till recent times. And when you pair that up with the table, we can really see the acreage burning. So intense fires that are harder to manage. And we put together a map of our fires within Deschutes County. So right, every year we have fires everywhere on the landscape that are forcing evacuations. And we kind of come around and we draw the picture of our fires in Central Oregon and how we've come to the place that we are now, right? And so the Aubrey Hall fire started a lot of the processes that we see today, the reason that we're all sitting here together talking about it. Project Wildfire was created out of this. We talk about the Aubrey Hall fire, over to the Skeleton fire. There's several fire scars that overlap. You know, at any time, also, I guess I should point this out, that if you're in these maps, you can, that top right corner, there's that expand. You can jump into the map and you can click on any of these fire scars. And it'll give you a little pop-up of the fire, when it happened, the acres that it burned. So some of these are quite old fires. Oh, that's new, sorry. Old fires are the green color. This is the last 100 years of fire occurrences. There's also on here, you can see all these little dots. These are all the fires that are less than 10 acres, and it's only a 10-year fire data set. So kind of showing the number of fire starts that are out there that happen every year that we don't really even know about. And just also showing that we live in that fire environment, right? We have lots of fire starts. Not always do they grow large, and a lot of that is due to the fire suppression activities that happen. And then they're color coded, whether they're human caused or if they are natural, like lightning. And we'll go back to the story map here. But we zoom around to several of these fires. Burgess Road fire takes a minute to draw. And we just kind of go chronological through it. The Two Bowls fire, discuss that fire right on the back side of Bend, kind of a wake up call to the community that we can have fires that stand up in our backyard. Rabbit Brush fire, crossing that intersection, or crossing the boundaries of fuel types, right? Because oftentimes we begin to think that we live in a fuel type that doesn't burn, but the reality is it all burns. It's pretty fun to look at some of this aerial imagery, and you begin to see fire scars that predate a lot of our development out there. The Roslyn Road fire, which was a great success story of some of the fuels treatments that have happened over the years. Great picture that shows that. I think a lot of people have seen the article that was put together this last year talking about the differences of the two sides of the road, where one side was treated, a lot of the fuel was removed out of there, and the fire burned with less intensity. It created quite the resilient stand, but it also gave great opportunity for fire suppression out there. So we frame up the fire history, and then we begin to turn to, knowing that we live in a fire environment, what we can do out there. Everyone's doing their parts, including the firefighters, but we also need to be doing our own part around our homes, helping them to continue to fight the fire while we protect our own homes, or do the work too, anyway. And then a short discussion about embers and the last 100 feet around our home. It's pretty easy for all of us to turn around, look at the forest or our neighboring properties and talk about the things that are not happening there. But the hardest thing is to remember or keep in mind that it actually matters more about what we do within the 100 foot of our home than what our neighbors do. And then we transition to talking about fire-wise communities. So similar to the map above, we'll be zooming around to the communities, and you can see the communities. I tried to get a couple pictures, highlight some of the work that they've done, but also provided links to their web pages, so you can open it up and see the communities that we're highlighting. You can find what they talk about or their projects that they're doing. So very similar to the last. So there's a link here to their webpage, but very similar to the last map. You can dive into the map in that top right corner. You can scroll around all over the place. And then if you click on any of these polygons of the communities, you get a short description of them, but also you get a link to their webpage. So that's not just a couple of communities, but you can go to pretty much any community within the story map and you should find their webpage, or at least a link back to Project Wildfire to help you get in touch with them if you find a project that you feel is interesting. So as I put these together, the plan was to try to find communities that were spread out throughout the county, so we kind of get representation from all the different areas, the different fuel types. And also the other part of that is trying to find different types of projects that they've done. So trying to highlight those, and then also, get their projects that are done, but also some of the newer communities versus some of the older communities. So Indian Ford is a newer community for us. And, yeah, we'll jump around to several communities. Again, highlight what they've done, links to their projects, links to some of the other references or materials that they've also looked at or done. So there's several that go through here. I'm not going to read each one of these. You guys can take a look at them later. So after we've kind of profiled some of those communities, I guess I got a couple notes on the communities, and we can get, well, maybe I'll come back to that. I was going to talk about them. Benefits of being Firewise, kind of run through some of those benefits. And remember, this is the part of the story map that I'm always telling myself, remember, I'm not thinking of this as the average citizen, because at this point, I think the average citizen would be like, I don't know if I want to continue looking at this, right? They probably got other things to surf the internet for. But, right, we have the benefits of being a Firewise community. And then we also have the basics of how to do the next steps, links to the risk assessment, what that means. And actually, I see that I don't have a link in here that I thought I had. I need to add the link in here that goes to the actual document that walks you through all the steps. I thought I had it, but I do not. And then the other resources that are out there. And these are all links as well, so you can link to other folks, ODF, ourselves, the Firewise USA program. And then the last piece of this is we're giving credits to Fire Adapted Communities Network for helping us walk through this, funding it, but also giving us input as we put it together. Okay, so there was a couple of things in that I kind of wanted to discuss. I know I ran through that pretty quickly and I didn't give everyone the opportunity to read it, but I hope that a lot of folks have already read it or already looked at it. One is when we look at the Firewise communities and you're scrolling through that and you feel that you would like your community to be profiled, or to show how you've done the process, or you see that or maybe your community is on there and you don't feel that it's being represented correctly, or you have a different project that you'd like to discuss, let me know and I'll put that together, right? The communities on here, the plan would be that we have several communities over time, and then we begin to take some off, add other ones to it, and we kind of rotate through them, showing those new communities, profiling what they're doing, and then also reaching back to older communities that have done several several projects, and be able to connect those two together so that so new communities would be able to see and then get help from older communities. So if you see yours is not on there and you'd like it to be, let me know. And then if you see something that's wrong on one of those, let me know. There's been a few edits that we've talked about on this already that I'm going to look into trying to incorporate. One is the navigation, right? Once you've looked at it once and gone through it, you'll find, just like myself, you want to be able to just jump to the pieces of it. You're like, I just want to see where the communities are, or I want to find this community contact information. What I want to do is be able to add navigation to it. So we'll see about adding a navigation bar across the top to jump into those different sections. The toolkit for new sites. So if you've come down to this point where I've got the slide up right now, and you're looking at wanting to become Firewise, and those new communities are like, well, what am I going to walk away from with here? I'd like to give them a toolkit that they can actually walk away with something and say, all right, here are my actionable items. Here are the next steps that I need to do to continue forward. And then I think the other piece that is, I explained it, but it doesn't always come across, but how to use the navigation if you were to be looking at the Firewise map and you're deciding that you want to navigate around and look at different communities, right? How do you do that? So I needed just a better how to navigate it. And then of course I got lots of grammatical errors in there to clean up as well. So so with that, I just kind of want to turn it over to any thoughts on it or questions or anything that you see that that I should be thinking about as we're kind of finalizing this story map. Crickets.
Boone, I think it looks awesome. I can't wait for this to be, for us to be able to share this.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. Yeah, you've been on my calendar, and I saw I got a couple emails over from you over the weekend in February. I set you up or put a reminder in there to contact you. And actually, your community is one that I'd like to profile as we put it together and figure out how to do the outreach. I feel like that's a big key for pushing the envelope into more communities. Ray, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, quick question. What do we need to send you for the description of our subdivision in terms of the project Wildfire Firewise?
So I think what I'd like to see is just kind of a project that you've done, and there only needs to be a paragraph or two, but a project that you've done, a link to any of the materials or anything that you used during that, and then I'll craft it up and then send a couple emails back and forth. Because remember, it is just it's a pretty short, I only put a couple of paragraphs for each community, but at least something to kind of pique some interest and then get folks headed in your direction. So it'd be just a paragraph or two of the project you want to talk about, any high points out of it, and then make sure that I have correct links to your web page and anything like that. Okay, and then Dean, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, Firewise communities. Are you promoting entire communities to become Firewise, or are you also making it clear that especially in a larger community that doesn't have cooperation, good cooperation, like a homeowners association, that sort of thing, that Firewise sites, one example I can think of is Deschutes River Woods is pretty large, and I know that there's some efforts there that started as a Firewise site where maybe it was just a few properties in one area, and it's spreading a little bit, and maybe eventually the entire community would adopt something.
Yeah, yes, that's a good point, Dean. So there's a couple of things that come to mind when you say that, right? So I guess just to expand on what you're talking about with Deschutes River Woods, at one point, Deschutes River Woods, the entire area was quote unquote Firewise. And what we found was we'd find that we were only working with a few landowners at a time, and they were doing everything quite well, but we also were missing a lot of folks. A lot of people didn't understand what it meant, didn't care, and it wasn't really moving through the community, if you will. And then Greg may have more to add to it, but as Allison began to work with Greg, we did an assessment down here, and actually, you know, it's been long enough that I don't remember doing 2 areas, but either way, there are 2 areas that we had driven through and set up. So the communities within these 2 polygons here that I'm moving my mouse between are the 2 areas that became Firewise. So the other piece of this right now is you're talking about HOAs and not having that infrastructure all ready to reach out. That's one of the things I'm working with Oliver about with Sundance. So Sundance is not Firewise. Sundance sits right here. And if we had the fire map scar, we would be looking at the skeleton fire scar right here among several others. But what Oliver and I have been trying to work out is a process to be able to engage the full community and to begin to build that network. So one of the ways that we're looking at it, and I hope that it works, and we're going to proceed forward here. So as to talk about the reminder was to start this process again, but we're hoping to be able to send out a letter to the community and then find out what kind of interest we have, gather contact information, and begin to build that infrastructure. And then from there, it would be a group that would be managed by the Firewise committee to kind of engage more of this group and then continue to push it out through the community. And what that looks like exactly, I don't know yet. We've drafted a couple letters between myself, Oliver, and Ed, but hopefully we'll be getting those out soon. We're hoping to send them out. I think we're talking about a March timeline and then begin to build it out and then still have time to prep before fire season, put on some kind of a fire-free project before we go into the spring and summer. And then hopefully we begin to continually get more participation. Hopefully that answers your question there, Dean.
Yeah, thanks, Boone.
Let's see, I'm just going to go from the top of what I have for raised hands. Bob Pulley.
Yeah, Boone, one of the things that being a new Firewise community that we found a little bit intimidating in the process is the dollar commitment per lot or per site. It might be helpful in your story map to put up the list of things that qualify for those dollars, that it's not necessarily a dollar amount, it's in-kind type of things that the community can do that really contributes to that. So
Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you, Bob. I'm putting a note in right now for my edits. Yeah, and what Bob's referring to is the Firewise communities. You want to Firewise wants to show a approximately $25, that 2543 investment towards Firewise activities, and that has thrown people off. I've had people ask me if they write the check to me or what they do. It's not the way that it works, but yeah, explaining that would be better. Would be good to add in there. Megan. If you're there. I see you unmuted, but we can't hear you. We're not hearing you, Megan. Okay, we'll come back to Megan. Ariel.
Hey, so kind of connected with Bob's point. I'm wondering if there's something you can put in there also addressing a common question of whether everyone in a neighborhood or in a community has to be on board.
No.
Yeah.
I'm saying if you could put that in there, address that, because I think that sometimes ends up being, people think that's a barrier and they won't even apply.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, I can definitely do that. There's a few like subtleties that are not explained in very great depth there. One is that Firewise, right, if you're not familiar with it, you may be under the impression of just what you said, that everybody has to meet a certain certification level, but the reality is it's a group effort showing that you're recognizing the need for preparedness and defensible space, and you're moving that forward.
Yeah, so just a sentence like that I think could be useful in this section. But yeah, otherwise looks fantastic.
Thank you. Okay, I got a note for that one. And then Megan, you want to try again here?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, gotcha.
Hello?
We got you. I guess you don't have us, but we hear you. Okay, well, perhaps we'll be able to come back to Megan. Looks like, Dean, you re-raised your hand, or is that the same one from earlier?
Yeah, it's me again. I thought of something else. In the Firewise sites or communities, do you also incorporate any kind of guidelines, maybe for structural hardening against ember intrusion in particular?
You know, on site visits, when we talk to folks, we do discuss that, but we don't go into great detail. Oftentimes it feels that we're focusing on that 0 to 5 and kind of the yearly maintenance. And we do discuss some of those other things, but they're not always, I would say, I don't think we've ever put it in as one of their 3 issues to work on, only because those tend to be quite costly, right? If we were asking everybody to replace their siding or to rescreen all their vents, we likely wouldn't be calling that out as an issue. We would discuss it with them, and we'd provide them with educational materials surrounding that. And then directly on the story map, I think you're raising a pretty good point, is that it's not just all of this, but maybe having a way to find home hardening resources. I think that's where you're thinking there.
Yes, I think a lot of people concentrate on the defensible space, and if you look at catastrophic wildfire in communities, structure to structure ignition is kind of a big deal. And so I wouldn't want people to feel like, okay, we're Firewise, we've been creating defensible space, so we're good.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, okay, and I've added some notes for to that point here to add some additional resources as well, and make note that we need to incorporate all of that into it. And there was a,
Thank you.
another, yeah, you're welcome, Dean. And I did get another comment in the past that was very similar to that. That was that, you know, we do a lot in Deschutes County, whether it's this group right here that we're talking to or others, but we do a lot, and it may be good to be able to still back up to that bigger picture and show that Firewise is a piece of that bigger picture. I tried to hit that in a slide earlier, but I don't think I drove it home quite well enough. Greg, you have your hand raised as well.
Here you go. You hear me?
Yeah, gotcha.
Okay, what it is you might put something in there about insurance can be reduced too. But I know of only one insurance company that uses that. That's USAA.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a yeah, that's a tough one, right? It is it's of note. It's definitely something to note. And then right now there is only one, but we can definitely put that in there under the benefits of Firewise, as the potential for decreased insurance rates.
Right, right.
Okay. I got. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, we're winding down on time. I just wanted to call attention for folks. I know y'all can read, so you can read through the chat, but Megan has put a few comments in the chat, and I just wanted to give some context to those. That Megan is our, she works for the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, which is the sponsor of this Firewise USA's nationwide program. And so just to put her comments in context, she's joining us in the context of her role, and works with Firewise communities recognized communities across the country. So give those comments a read. And Boone, with that, do you just want to give a call out to any, I guess you'll take some comments through email over the next few days if people have them?
Yep, that's correct. Yep, if you, you know, and I think my preference would be, if you haven't already done it, is to spend some time, look through it, and think about the audience that we're trying to line up with that story map, and see if we're hitting that mark, and then send me back your comments or edits or things that you see that can be adjusted, and suggestions. You know, I may not take all comments, but yeah, definitely send anything to me that you see needs to be addressed.
Great, thanks everybody. So we just have a couple minutes left. So I would just open it up from a roundtable fashion. If you have any kind of pressing updates for the group that you want to share real briefly, let us know. You can just go ahead and come off mute or drop something in the chat by means of an update before we close out our meeting this morning here in a couple minutes. Anybody with updates?
I'll step in real quick. This is Tony DeBone, Commissioner. That story map tool is going to be valuable. It really has a lot of information. Being able to click on those neighborhoods, being able to, you know, the neighborhoods or the fire scars, any geographic area is going to be a real good tool. So I'm looking forward to that getting mature. Also, I want to thank everybody that provided input just now. Some wonderful little items just to plug into that story map. So we've seen that. I think there was the Forest Service big fuel reduction project application at the federal level. They use that story map also, that tool, and it really puts it in perspective. So just thank you very much for that.
Great, thanks, Commissioner. Gordon?
Yeah, and just one quick update for the group. So with preliminary results with Western States Fire Managers grants, looks like we got awarded the Three Creeks grant in Deschutes County, and then also potentially the a Crook County grant. So just wanted to throw that out there just as an update.
Great, good news. Anybody else with a short update you want to share with the group? Okay, well, maybe we'll end 5 minutes early. Don't see anybody else coming off mute. So, okay, well, thank you all for joining us. I did put a link to the story map. There was also a link in Boone's email announcement of this meeting. So give that a little bit closer look. You can actually read through it at your own speed and send us any thoughts you have. And like Boone says, we'll try to incorporate those that we can into the revised story map, and then we'll probably be publicizing that here in the next few weeks over a variety of channels. So look for that to go public in the next week or two. Anything else, Boone, before we close it up? Okay.
Nope, just thank you guys all for the inputs. I appreciate it.
Okay, we'll see you back here next month, folks.